All right, hey, it's Rob, and happy anniversary to London Calling. 42 years old this week. Hard to believe, but I'm getting up there too. This is my original copy that I purchased, not in 1979 when it was released in the UK. I didn't live in the UK, and not in January 1980 when it was released here in the States. I probably picked it up around 1982 at a used record store in my hometown of Oak Park, Michigan. And this record here basically changed my entire life. As a matter of fact, that record there was the reason why I took a big old stack of records that I had already owned and put them in the trunk of a car belonging to a friend of mine who handed me $40, I think, and drove away with my entire record collection other than London Calling by The Clash. Basically, I started all over again collecting records. This was number one. This was the only record I owned, at least for a brief amount of time. I'll explain why that was. So, back in the 70s, when I was in middle school, going into high school, of course, you had the two camps. You had rock and you had disco. And there were very few people who at least would admit that they were somewhere on the fence when you had that discussion. Do you like rock or do you like disco? It was one or the other. Of course, there were racist overtones to that as well. I went to a school that was pretty much like 50-50 Caucasian and African American students in my high school. And, basically all the white kids liked rock. They hated disco. All the black kids, of course, loved soul and funk, R&B, disco, and, weren't big rock fans, didn't know, a lot of the big rock bands that were around at the time. You would go to a concert and you wouldn't see a single black face. Now, that kind of segregation, of course, is offensive to me, and more than offensive, because I don't think it's altogether intentional. It's just kind of depressing and sad that people don't, go out of their comfort zones and discover this kind of music because, their friends listen to this or their friends listen to that. I don't want to get into that whole discussion, but in any case, be that as it may, in the 70s, I was a typical kid. I loved all the big rock bands that, were around even before my time. Matter of fact, a few years before my time for sure. And I got into them because I had a friend named John Myers. John had a brother named Dave, and Dave had a big old record collection in their living room and a set of headphones and a turntable. And he would let you just come over, put whatever you want on, stick your headphones on. I remember sitting there with John's parents in the room and just checking out these records. Well, I got into the music that he had because that was like one of my few outlets for hearing records other than the radio or whatever else, was going on at the time. So I got into the same stuff that my friend John got into because we both started playing guitar. He started playing bass. We started playing together, doing little gigs, that kind of stuff. And John loved Black Sabbath. So I loved and still do love Black Sabbath. And John's brother loved Zeppelin. And John's brother loved the typical, bands that people would be into back then. He also loved this Dutch band called Focus, who had this crazy song called Hocus Pocus. I still love them as well. They were kind of outside. They were outliers there in his record collection. But otherwise, basically, he had the same kind of stuff, AC/DC and, The Who and whoever else people were listening to back then on just, classic rock radio. It wasn't even called classic rock radio back then. It was just rock radio. Now it's pretty much the same. They just call it classic rock. So I listened to that stuff. That's what I got into. Those are the early records I started buying. I remember I owned records by the Moody Blues, and I really liked this guy, Donovan, the folk singer. Again, not really a part of that same tradition, but it was all music previous to, my generation, previous to the, present time that I was living in. And I wasn't really listening to any current bands. Of course, by 1980, we had John Bonham's death, and we had, of course, Keith Moon's death. A lot of those bands, The Who and Zeppelin and Sabbath, right at the cusp of 1980 were pretty much defunct or had morphed into something different than what they originally were. And it was getting a bit long in the tooth for sure. Of course, the punk movement happened in England in 77, and we didn't know about the punk movement in Oak Park, Michigan. And eventually that stuff kind of started to filter over. You started to see people who called themselves punk rockers and that sort of thing. I never, consider myself a punk rocker, but I sure loved a lot of punk rock bands. Of course, The Clash being one of them, if not the biggest one, that I loved and still love to this day. But the real change happened when I started to get involved in my high school radio station. We had a radio station. You would go in there. We had a huge, again, selection of records, and you would start to find all these things that you didn't know existed. I got into things like Kate Bush at that time and the Talking Heads and bands that were certainly, outside of your normal straight ahead rock and roll format. And at some point, somehow, I stumbled upon the Clash's London Calling. I used to be able to get on my bike and ride to our local record store, which is called Flipside Records in Oak Park, Michigan. It was in the mall right next to Dexter Davison supermarket where my mom used to get groceries. I would be in that record store all the time. Like I said, I was a latchkey kid. I don't think my folks knew where I was half the time, and it wasn't a problem. Most of the time I was probably over at Flipside Records, buying a record or just going through the racks or whatever. And I remember at one point going through the racks and picking this exact LP up right here. I don't know if I really knew it or I just looked at it and I thought, oh, that looks cool. It has a sticker on it that says, this album includes lyric content which may be offensive to some members of the public. Early attempts, of course, at censorship, which would take off more later in the mid-'80s. But for whatever reason, that just appealed to me. I saw these cool-looking guys on the back, all these songs, what's going on? And then, of course, you got all the lyrics, pictures, and it was this, no-frills package. It wasn't some big gatefold, fancy artwork, big sprawling two-disc set. They just shoved them all in the same pocket there, and who knows, I probably paid $4 for it. But I started listening to this, and for whatever reason, it just rewired my brain to music. This was a current band that was happening at the time. I could go see them in concert, and I did. I saw them open for The Who at the Pontiac Silverdome, I think in 82. They were pretty much booed off the stage, but I loved it. It was The Clash. And, they were a current band that was happening at the time, not something that was my friend's brother's era or my parents' era, God forbid, or something that happened way back in the 70s when I was basically an infant. They were a current happening band that I could be into that were, continuing to put out records. If I liked London Calling, wow, imagine my surprise when Sandinista came out a couple of years later, and it was 3 records of The Clash. It was amazing. So, there was something appealing, of course, to being a fan of a current band that was still putting out great records. There was this girl who was also instrumental. Her name is Sarah O'Leary. She was a very cute punk rock chick who would just hang out between the hallways, and they'd smoke those beady cigarettes and stuff that I never really got into. But, man, I thought she was cool. And I remember one day I went to the radio station and she asked me what bands I was into. This was before I discovered all this. And I said Zeppelin and AC/DC and Sabbath or whatever. She just kind of laughed or sneered and walked away. I thought, uh-oh, did I say something wrong? And that's, I think, kind of opened my eyes to the fact that there were these other bands doing really interesting, vital music out there that were happening today, that were existing in, the current musical landscape, not something that your brother or your sister listened to. So this album here was it for me, and I looked at all my other records, and I just took that stack of records. I sold them to this girl named Joan for $40. She put them in her trunk, and off they went, and this is all I owned was The Clash's London Calling. But what a cool record. I mean, this is an early copy, of course, which doesn't even mention the fact that Train in Vain is on the end of side 4, their biggest hit from the record, which they just slapped on here at the end. Why not? 19 songs. And it was originally supposed to be, I think, on a flexi disc, almost a throwaway song. But ended up on this record. Of course, it was huge. So I won't get into so much why this record is fantastic and how cool it is, and of course the multiple musical styles you get into: reggae and dub and jazz and almost country, disco. I mean, you name it. It's like a melting pot of musical styles in there. And to this day, I listen to this and find stuff and different influences. And, oh, look at that! And look what they threw in there. It's such a cool record. So, of course, if you don't know this record, if it's just not something that has crossed into your plane of existence up to this point, of course you got to listen to it. It's amazing, incredible. I actually went and covered this whole record. I'm a singer, songwriter, guitar player. And they posted the drum tracks online, just Topper's drum tracks. Topper's the drummer for The Clash. A fabulous, great drummer, jazz-trained, very unlikely drummer to be in a punk rock band, but so cool. He does so much cool stuff with percussion and really gets into intricate playing on this record, and just great stuff. And just to be able to play along with Topper's drum tracks, was really just a fantastic experience. For me, I started doing it. I covered 1, I covered 2, I ended up covering all 19 songs on this record, singing and playing everything other than the original drum tracks, which I played along to. It was a really fun project. They're on my YouTube channel. You can search them out and find them if you care to. So I'm not going to drag on too long about this, but just to point out that this was the record that did it for me. It really was a big shift. I got a cassette recorder maybe around 1981, I think. I got my original stereo in 79. This album came out a week, I think, after my bar mitzvah, which was December 8th, I think, 79. And this thing came out a week later, so they were really contemporary. And like I said, I didn't get it originally when it came out. I would have been 13. I just wasn't there yet. But a couple of years later, I bought it. And from there on, I mean, you can just see I found an original stack of cassettes that my mom found in a box a little while ago. And you can just see the stuff I was listening to. Of course, MTV came out in 1981. We had MTV in my house because, as part of the radio station, we got a $10,000 grant from Continental Cablevision, the cable company in my town. And so everyone had cable in our town, and my folks were involved in city government. So all 4 of us had cable in our individual bedrooms on our individual TVs. So I could rush home anytime at lunch and see all the cool stuff, because they'd always play the cool, interesting new wave, stuff from England during lunch for some reason. So I got into all these bands through MTV. This is number 1, the first tape I ever recorded. This is the band Aztec Camera, Scottish band. They used to play them on MTV. There was something underneath this, and I covered it up. So this was originally Culture Club. For some reason, I decided that I was going to tape Squeeze over it. But I really got into Culture Club again, another MTV band. I really got into stuff like Thomas Dolby. And you have to remember that back then, you didn't really hear a lot of these bands. Of course, I saw Blinded by Science video, but I think I was even into them before that because I read about them in Musician Magazine. You'd have to really look for reviews and read about bands. You couldn't really hear a lot of records. It wasn't like today where we have access to everything at our fingertips. You really had to dig around and search, and that was part of the challenge and part of what made you feel like you're in this cool club, because you knew about all these bands that most of the people out there really didn't know about at all, and you got judged for it too. I mean, when I started Michigan State in 1984, I wasn't punk, but I certainly had a new wave look or whatever, my hair, my clothes, and I got judged for it, and people would laugh and snicker and point or whatever, because I was wearing black shoes and the mustard yellow pants or whatever it was. But, most people were not into this kind of stuff at all. And I got into all these bands just, somehow by searching them out. Bands like, this is China Crisis. There's old Thomas Dolby. I've got the Talking Heads here. This was the Boomtown Rats, who I love. I got Laurie Anderson on here. Altered Images, another Scottish band. Let's see. Here's my Kate Bush. Lena Lovitch. We got David Byrne and Brian Eno, My Life in the Bush Ghosts. That's not something you're going to hear on the radio. Anyway, so I started with this record, which preceded all these cassettes I recorded, and then I got into all these kind of edgy new wave punky bands, and all the other punk rock adjacent bands, new wave adjacent bands like the Cars and bands that had those elements. Even Rush, loved the Police and started to sound like the Police on some of their records. So all those influences slowly creeped into the music happening at the time. But I was kind of maybe a little bit ahead of the curve. I was into these bands before a lot of people knew them. Of course, bands like REM. And I just saw this great 40th anniversary REM concert last night. They did a tribute to Chronic Town, their first EP. And I was into them way back in the beginning, way before you heard them on the radio. And it was a really interesting transition to be into these bands, have these bands that you knew and loved, and you're kind of like a part of a little, elite club of people who knew who the Replacements were, knew who the 3 O'Clock were, or whatever. And then a lot of these bands started to shift more into the mainstream, no more so than REM, of course, who got huge and one of the biggest bands in the world. And you always just were like, I used to listen to them back in the day when nobody knew who they were at all. But that's how it was. That was kind of the transition from bands, coming over from England and little indie bands that you knew about that nobody else did, and slowly made their way to the mainstream. And here we are today, 42 years later, and The Clash's London Calling is sitting right over my shoulder here, and I'm saying what a great record it still is. I have not ever for 1 second lost interest in any of this music. I love this just as much, if not more, than when I first discovered it. I'd be happy to put it on any time and listen to it, and I might go do that right now. So, all right, thanks for letting me, yammer on here about the good old days, but it's so different now. You have access to everything, and I think about our world, and it's so easy now. We had to struggle. We had to go look at a record jacket and think, is the music in here good? Like we just would be seeing through the record jacket onto the grooves and like, what does this sound like? There's a guy smashing a bass guitar. Is that what it sounds like? I don't know. Like, we're just going to have to buy it and, go ahead and pull the trigger and, see what you get. So, anyway, signing off. Thanks, and we'll see you soon.